The distress signal had been pulsing for 3 days before the Meridian intercepted it, a rhythmic whisper in the cosmic static that shouldn't have existed this far beyond charted space. James Corrigan stood in the observation deck, watching the structure materialize through the viewport as their ship decelerated. It wasn't derelict. The station's running lights traced elegant geometric patterns across its surface, and its solar arrays tracked their approach with unnerving precision. "So much for abandoned," Maya Santos muttered beside him, her pilot's instincts clearly on high alert. "That thing's been watching us since we dropped out of hyperspace." James adjusted his translation interface, checking the linguistic algorithms one more time. His hands were steadier than his pulse. 20 years of first contact protocols, and he still got nervous. Though usually the species they encountered didn't build structures that could house a small city and apparently enjoyed sending distress signals just to see who'd show up. Dr. Elena Vasquez joined them, her xenobiology scanner already active and painting holographic data across her forearm. Energy signatures are consistent with Tier 4 civilization technology, maybe Tier 5. They're running quantum processors that make our shipboard AI look like an abacus. She paused, frowning at a readout. They've been here a while, decades minimum, just sitting here watching our sector of space. Creepy, Maya offered helpfully. "I'm going with creepy." The comm crackled. Captain Rhodes's voice carried the weight of someone who'd been making difficult decisions for too long. "Away team, you're cleared for shuttle approach. They've sent docking coordinates. Very polite coordinates, I might add, almost like they were expecting us." "Because that's not ominous at all," James said, earning a snort from Maya. The shuttle ride was mercifully brief, though James spent most of it reviewing the fragmentary transmissions they'd received. The language was unlike anything in the known database, but there were patterns, mathematical elegances that suggested intentional communication rather than random noise. Whoever these people were, they understood that language was more than words. The docking bay was immaculate, impossibly so. Not the sterile cleanliness of human spacecraft, but something more organic, as if the metal itself rejected dust and disorder. A delegation waited for them, 7 figures in flowing garments that seemed to shift colors based on the ambient light. They were humanoid enough that James felt his shoulders relax slightly, then tense again when he noticed the details that marked them as decidedly other. The central figure stepped forward, tall, composed, with an authority that required no announcement. Her garments were deeper blue than the others, threaded with silver that caught the light like captured starlight. And her ears, elegant, elongated, sweeping back from her temples in graceful curves that would have made Tolkien weep with vindication. "Welcome to Outpost Thessara," she said in flawless English, though James's linguistic interface registered the translation layer underneath. "I am Commander Thalara. We've been observing your species with considerable interest." Elena recovered first, stepping forward with practiced diplomatic grace. "Dr. Elena Vasquez, representing the Earth Coalition. This is James Corrigan, our linguistics specialist, and Maya Santos, our pilot. We received your distress signal." Something flickered across Thalara's face. Amusement, maybe. Distress signal, yes. My apologies for the deception. We needed a reason for contact that wouldn't violate your first contact protocols. A species in distress seemed less threatening than, "We've been watching you for 50 years, and decided you're finally interesting enough to talk to." Maya let out a bark of laughter. "I like her already." James was trying to remember his training. Establish communication, assess intentions, build rapport, standard procedure. Except his brain had apparently decided that now was the perfect time to forget every protocol he'd ever memorized. Because Thalara had turned those amber eyes directly toward him, and the universe had just lurched sideways. It wasn't rational. It wasn't explainable. It was simply a recognition so profound that his breath caught, a sense of significance that made absolutely no sense given that he'd known this woman for approximately 45 seconds. Time didn't stop. That was poetic nonsense. But it certainly stumbled, lost its footing, and had to catch itself on the furniture. Thalara's expression changed. Just for a heartbeat, her careful composure cracked, revealing something that looked almost like shock. Then it was gone, smoothed over with practiced ease, but James had seen it. Whatever had just happened, she'd felt it too. Or he was having a stroke. That was also possible. Perhaps, Thalara continued, her voice only slightly less steady, we should adjourn to more comfortable surroundings. I'm certain you have many questions and we have much to discuss. The tour through the station was a blur of impossible architecture and technology that made Alina vibrate with barely suppressed scientific ecstasy. Maya kept up a running commentary of observations that ranged from tactical to absurd. James managed to participate in the conversation, even asked reasonably intelligent questions about their quantum communication systems, all while acutely aware of exactly where Thalara was in the room at any given moment. Professional. He was going to be professional. The negotiation chamber was less a room and more a statement. Curved walls displayed real-time stellar cartography, showing human space as a small cluster of lights in a much larger, carefully mapped region. The furniture adapted to their physiology as they sat, which was either extremely considerate or showed exactly how long they'd been studying humanity. You mentioned 50 years of observation, Alina began, settling into the role of primary negotiator with visible relief. That's quite a commitment for a first contact scenario. Thalara folded her hands on the table. Your species is at an interesting developmental threshold. You've achieved interstellar capability but retained your cultural diversity. You're scientifically advanced but haven't lost your capacity for art, humor, or apparently, she glanced at Maya, irreverence in the face of the unknown. We wanted to understand you before we revealed ourselves. And the verdict? Maya asked. Still deliberating, Thalara replied, but there was warmth beneath the formality. Though your response to our distress signal speaks favorably, you came to help, not to exploit. The discussion continued, dancing around the larger questions of why and what now. James contributed where appropriate, his linguistic training allowing him to catch nuances in the translation that others missed. Thalara's people valued precision, but there was poetry in their speech patterns, a love of language that matched his own. Their eyes met again across the table, and this time neither looked away immediately. There was a question in that gaze, an acknowledgement of something neither could name. Cairn, one of Thalara's advisors, cleared his throat with exaggerated delicacy. Perhaps our guests would appreciate quarters to rest. I'm certain the journey was taxing, and we have much to arrange. Thalara blinked, breaking the moment. Of course, forgive me, we've prepared accommodations. Tomorrow we can begin proper cultural exchanges. As they were escorted to their assigned rooms, Maya sidled up to James. So, she said quietly, are we going to talk about whatever that was back there, or are we pretending it didn't happen? James stared at his door panel. I have no idea what you're talking about. Right, and I'm the queen of Saturn. Get some sleep, linguist. Something tells me things just got complicated. His quarters were more luxurious than any station housing had a right to be, but James barely noticed. He lay in the darkness, staring at a ceiling that displayed a gentle simulation of Earth's night sky, another sign of how well they knew humanity, and tried to make sense of the senseless. He'd fallen in love at first sight exactly once before, at 19, and it had been a disaster of epic proportions that taught him the valuable lesson that instant attraction was usually just chemistry lying to you. This felt different, deeper, like recognizing someone he'd been searching for without knowing he was searching. Ridiculous, impossible, completely inappropriate given the political and scientific implications of this contact. And yet, as sleep finally claimed him, his last conscious thought was of amber eyes and the unsettling certainty that Thalara had known. Somehow, she'd known before he did. Tomorrow was going to be interesting. Thalara dismissed the last of her advisors with a gesture that was perhaps more abrupt than queenly protocol demanded. The moment the chamber doors sealed, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for the past 3 hours and pressed her palms against the cool surface of her desk. 347 years of life, and this was a first. The resonance ability was supposed to be reliable, predictable, rooted in evolutionary biology that her people had spent millennia understanding. It detected compatible genetic markers, harmonious neurological patterns, complementary pheromone signatures. It was science, not magic, and it absolutely, definitively, should not work across species barriers with a human whose biology was so divergent from her own that they couldn't even metabolize the same proteins. Yet the moment that linguist had walked into her station, every quantum receptor in her nervous system had lit up like a supernova. "You're brooding," Chiron announced, materializing from the private entrance with the casual disregard for boundaries that came from 5 decades of friendship. He carried 2 glasses of Methara wine and wore an expression of unholy amusement. "I can hear you brooding from 3 corridors away. It's very loud brooding." Thalara accepted the wine without comment. "I'm contemplating the political ramifications of our first official contact with humanity." "You're spiraling about the short-lived linguistic specialist with the expressive eyes and the complete inability to hide what he's feeling." Chiron settled into the chair across from her, with the ease of someone who'd watched her grow from an awkward princess into a composed queen, and knew exactly where all the cracks in that composure lived. The one who looked at you like you'd personally hung the stars, then spent the next 2 hours trying to pretend he hadn't. "I don't know what you're implying." "Thalara, I was there. I watched you nearly forget how to speak 3 separate languages, which is impressive considering you invented 2 of them." He sipped his wine, eyes dancing with mischief. "The resonance kicked in, didn't it?" She wanted to deny it. Should deny it. Instead, she found herself nodding, feeling the weight of centuries suddenly pressing down on her shoulders. "Immediately. Stronger than anything in the records. I've read accounts from the old days before we decided emotion was inefficient, and even those pale in comparison to what I felt when he entered the chamber." Chiron let out a low whistle. "With a human, oh, this is delicious. The council is going to have collective apoplexy." "This isn't amusing, Chiron." "It's extremely amusing. You've spent 3 centuries being the perfect monarch, logical, measured, untouchable. And the universe sends you an impossible connection with someone from a species we're not even supposed to be officially meeting yet." He raised his glass in a mock toast. "The symmetry is poetic." Thalara stood, pacing to the viewport that overlooked the nebula. The colors shifted and swirled, indifferent to the chaos unfolding in her carefully ordered existence. He felt it too. I could see it in his biorhythms, the dilation of his pupils, the elevated heart rate. Humans don't have the resonance ability, but the connection still registered. He has no context for what happened. "And you're going to do what, exactly? Ignore it. Pretend the universe didn't just throw you the most complicated gift in the history of either species." "I'm going to study it." The words came out more defensive than she intended. "The resonance has never manifested cross-species before. This could be significant for understanding the underlying mechanisms. If we can map how it functions across such divergent biology, we might finally crack the quantum consciousness theories that have eluded us for centuries." Chiron made a sound that might have been a cough or might have been poorly suppressed laughter. "Right. Very scientific. I'm sure that's why you've arranged for him specifically to be the primary human liaison for the cultural exchange program." "That's pure logic. He's their linguistic specialist. The exchange requires extensive communication and translation work. He's the obvious choice." "Keep telling yourself that, Your Majesty." Chiron set down his glass and his expression softened. "Thalara, I've known you since you were 50 years old, and trying to convince your mother that emotional suppression was damaging our society. You've always believed in honoring what we feel, even when it's inconvenient, even when the council thinks we should be above such things. This is different. This is. She struggled for words, pressing her fingertips to her temples. He's human, Chiron. Their lifespans are barely a century. He'll be gone in the time it takes me to adjust one policy directive. And that's assuming this contact even proceeds, assuming the council approves, assuming his people don't decide we're a threat. So you're going to feel nothing, because mathematics says it's impractical. I'm going to be rational about this. Rationality, Chiron said dryly, is what got our civilization to the point where half our people go through life without experiencing a genuine emotion and think that's an achievement. You want to be rational? Fine. Rationally speaking, this resonance is real, it's happening, and ignoring it won't make it disappear. It'll just make you miserable while you pretend otherwise. Thalara turned from the viewport, meeting her friend's knowing gaze. What would you have me do? March into his quarters and announce that my obsolete biological programming has decided he's my genetic complement? That should go wonderfully. I'd have you be honest, with him, with yourself, with the council if it comes to that. Chiron stood, moving to stand beside her at the window. You've spent 3 centuries arguing that we lost something vital when we decided logic was superior to feeling. This is your chance to prove it. The resonance exists for a reason. Maybe it's not just about genetics. Maybe it's about recognizing the souls that complement our own, regardless of what packaging they come in. You're being unusually philosophical. You're being unusually stubborn. He nudged her shoulder with his. Tomorrow you start your cultural exchange sessions. You'll be spending hours with him, translating concepts and building bridges between civilizations. You really think you can do that while pretending you don't feel what you feel? Thalara didn't answer immediately. In the reflection of the viewport, she could see herself, ageless features that would remain unchanged long after James Corrigan's hair had gone white and his expressive eyes had dimmed. The thought shouldn't hurt as much as it did. I'll be professional, she said finally. I'll conduct the exchanges as planned, and I'll observe what happens. If the resonance persists, if it's genuine and not just an anomaly, then I'll consider how to proceed. And if he asks you directly, then I'll be honest. The words came easier than expected. I've never been good at lying, especially not to someone the resonance has marked. Chiron grinned. There's the queen I know. The one who rewrote half our social codes because she refused to accept that things had to be the way they'd always been. He collected both wine glasses, heading toward the door. Get some rest. Tomorrow you get to spend several hours in close proximity to a human who looks at you like you invented light, while you pretend your quantum receptors aren't screaming that you found something you didn't know you were missing. Should be entertaining. Your support is overwhelming. Always. He paused at the threshold. For what it's worth, I think the universe has excellent timing. You've been lonely for longer than you'd ever admit. Maybe it took someone from another world to finally match your frequency. After he left, Thalara remained at the viewport, watching the nebula paint colors across the darkness. Somewhere in the guest quarters, James Corrigan was probably lying awake, trying to rationalize what had passed between them with the same desperate logic she was attempting. The resonance pulsed gently in her awareness, a constant reminder that some things transcended reason. She pulled up his file on her personal console, information gathered from decades of observation. Linguist, translator, specialist in finding common ground between disparate communication systems. He'd spent his career building bridges between cultures that thought they had nothing to say to each other. Perhaps that was its own kind of resonance. Tomorrow, she'd begin the cultural exchange. She'd be professional, measured, appropriate. She'd treat this as the significant diplomatic and scientific opportunity it represented. And she'd try very hard not to notice the way his entire face transformed when he smiled, or the fact that her 300-year-old heart had suddenly remembered how to race. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor after all. The observation deck wrapped around the station's upper tier like a crown of transparent crystal, offering an unobstructed view of the nebula that had become the backdrop to something James couldn't quite name. He arrived early for their first official cultural exchange session, partly because punctuality was professional, and partly because he'd been awake, since what his body insisted was 3 in the morning, despite the station's lighting cycle suggesting otherwise. Thalara was already there, standing before a holographic display that showed what appeared to be a family tree, except the branches extended both vertically through time and horizontally through dimensions he couldn't identify. She turned as he entered, and for a heartbeat neither of them moved. "Good morning," she said, and James was grateful that his translation interface gave him a moment to compose himself while it processed the layered meanings in her native tongue. "I thought we might begin with comparative mythology. It's often where common ground reveals itself between cultures." "Makes sense," James managed, settling into a chair that adjusted to his frame with unnerving precision. "We tell ourselves stories to explain the universe. Even when we know better, we keep telling them." "Precisely." She smiled, and James wondered if his people's cardiovascular systems were designed to handle that particular expression. Probably not. This is our creation narrative, though we've known for millennia that it's metaphorical. We still teach it to children because the truth it carries matters more than the facts it gets wrong. The hologram shifted, displaying figures that might have been gods, or might have been extremely advanced ancestors doing things that bent physics in uncomfortable directions. James leaned forward, his linguistic training kicking in as he studied the symbolic language woven through the imagery. "They're dividing light from darkness," he said slowly, "but not literally. This is about consciousness emerging from quantum uncertainty, isn't it? The observation creating reality rather than discovering it." Thalara's expression brightened with something that looked dangerously close to delight. "Yes. Most species need centuries to grasp that underlying concept. You saw it immediately." "I cheat. I've spent 20 years looking for the patterns beneath what people say." He pulled up Earth's creation myths on his own tablet, projecting them into the shared space. "We have dozens of versions, but they share common threads: chaos becoming order, potential becoming actual, the universe learning to know itself." They fell into discussion easily, trading stories and interpretations, finding unexpected parallels between civilizations separated by stellar distances. Thalara's people had a trickster figure not unlike Coyote or Loki, though theirs had apparently been based on a real politician from their early history, whose chaos-sowing tendencies had accidentally accelerated their technological development by 3 centuries. "We built a monument to him," Thalara said, pulling up an image of an elaborate statue. "Then we built a second monument to everyone who had to clean up his messes. They're the same height. We believe in balance." James laughed. "We mostly just argue about whether the chaos causers were brilliant or terrible, and never reach conclusions. Though we did once elect one as president, so perhaps we're not the best judges." "You elected chaos." "Multiple times, actually. It's practically a tradition." She shook her head, but she was smiling. "Your species is either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish." "Why not both?" The hours disappeared. They moved from mythology to philosophy, from ancient wisdom to modern ethics. James found himself talking about humanity's struggle with its own capacity for both transcendent kindness and spectacular cruelty, the constant tension between what they were and what they wanted to become. Thalara countered with her people's own history, the centuries-long debate about whether eliminating emotional volatility had made them wiser or simply duller. "We stopped writing poetry," she said quietly, pulling up fragments of ancient verse that the translation matrix struggled to capture. "For almost 200 years, no one wrote anything that wasn't technical documentation or historical record. We thought we'd evolved beyond art. Then a child drew a picture of a sunset and her parents didn't understand why, because sunsets were just stellar mechanics and optical physics. That's when we realized we'd made a terrible mistake. What changed? A movement started. Artists, philosophers, people who remembered that understanding a thing and appreciating a thing weren't the same. My mother was part of it. She helped rewrite our educational codes to include what we called the illogical subjects: music, art, the study of beauty for its own sake. Thalara's fingers traced patterns in the holographic display. I grew up in both worlds. The old guard who thought emotion was weakness, and the reformers who thought we'd nearly destroyed ourselves by forgetting how to feel. Which side won? Neither, both. We're still arguing about it. She glanced at him. Your people never stopped feeling, did you, even when it hurt you? We've tried, usually makes things worse. James pulled up images of Earth art, cave paintings, cathedrals, space stations designed with aesthetics in mind, despite the added cost. We keep making beautiful things even when it's impractical. Maybe especially when it's impractical. It's how we prove we're more than just survival machines. I envy that, Thalara said softly. Your species' stubborn insistence on meaning. Their eyes met, and the conversation shifted into territory that had nothing to do with comparative cultural analysis. James felt the same recognition he'd experienced in the negotiation chamber, stronger now, impossible to dismiss as exhaustion or disorientation. Can I ask you something? The words came out before his better judgment could stop them. Yesterday, when we first met, did you feel? He stopped, unsure how to articulate something he barely understood himself. Thalara went very still. Outside the viewport, the nebula continued its slow dance, indifferent to the small drama unfolding in its light. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested she was choosing words with extreme care. My people had an ability, though it's faded in most. In my bloodline, it remains. She turned to face him fully. We call it resonance. It's a form of quantum entanglement in our neural structures that recognizes compatible consciousness patterns. It tells us when we've found someone whose existence harmonizes with our own. James felt his heart rate spike and knew she could probably sense it somehow. And I felt it the moment you walked into my station. Stronger than anything in our records. Which shouldn't be possible between our species, but apparently the universe has opinions about what should and shouldn't be possible. The observation deck suddenly felt very small and very large at the same time. James processed this, his translator's mind working through the implications. So you knew, before I did. Seconds before, perhaps. A hint of humor flickered across her features. You weren't particularly subtle about your reaction. In my defense, I had no context for what was happening. I just thought I was having some kind of crisis. He ran a hand through his hair. This is real, not just, I don't know, some kind of electromagnetic interference or cultural misunderstanding. As real as anything I've experienced in 300 years. The number hung between them. 300 years. James did the math automatically, the translator's habit of quantifying everything. She'd been alive when humanity was still arguing about whether heavier-than-air flight was possible. She'd watched civilizations rise and fall across the galaxy while Earth struggled through its growing pains. You're thinking about the lifespan differential, Thalara said, reading him with unsettling accuracy. I can see it in your expression. It's kind of hard not to. I've got maybe 70 years left if I'm lucky and avoid accidents. That's a rounding error in your timeline. Yes, she didn't flinch from the reality. Which is why I spent most of last night trying to convince myself this was a terrible idea and I should maintain professional distance and forget the resonance existed. How'd that work out? Poorly. The admission came with a self-deprecating smile. Cairn, my advisor, you met him yesterday, pointed out that I've spent 3 centuries arguing that my people were wrong to suppress what they felt. That ignoring this would make me a hypocrite of spectacular proportions. James found himself smiling despite the absurdity of the entire situation. Your advisor sounds wise. He's unbearably smug, but occasionally correct. Thalara moved closer, though she maintained careful distance. I don't have answers, James. I don't know what this means or where it goes. The political complications alone are staggering. My people barely approved this contact. If they knew their queen was experiencing resonance with a human, there would be factions calling for my removal and your immediate deportation. So we're keeping this quiet. For now, while we figure out what this even is. She paused. Though I should mention, I may have arranged for you to be the primary liaison for our cultural exchange program, which means we'll be working together extensively, daily sessions like this one. That's very convenient. I told myself it was purely logical. Kyron didn't believe me either. James laughed, the sound escaping before he could stop it. Here they were, two people from different worlds having perhaps the most consequential conversation in either species' history, and somehow it felt like the most natural thing in the universe. So what do? We continue the exchanges. We get to know each other. We see if what we felt was a momentary anomaly or something more. Thalara's expression turned serious. And we're honest. About what we're feeling, what we're risking, what we're hoping for. Can you do that? I'm a linguist. Honesty is literally my job. He met her amber gaze steadily. I can do that. Then we'll proceed, carefully. Carefully, James agreed. The alarm that shattered the moment 3 seconds later suggested the universe had other plans. The alarm carried harmonics that James's translation interface couldn't process, which probably meant they were designed to communicate urgency in frequencies humans couldn't naturally hear. Thalara's entire posture shifted in an instant, the warmth draining from her expression as she accessed a data stream that painted urgent symbols across her forearm. Political emergency, she said tersely. Stay here. I'll return when I can. She was gone before James could formulate a response, leaving him alone in the observation deck with a half-finished conversation, and a growing sense that their carefully discussed caution had just become drastically more complicated. Maya found him 20 minutes later, her pilot's instincts having led her through the station's corridors with the confidence of someone who'd already memorized every escape route. So, she said without preamble, the nice aliens are having what looks like a very intense council meeting. There are security forces positioned at every major junction, and Alina is practically vibrating with anthropological excitement. Want to tell me what's going on? I have absolutely no idea. But you were with the Queen when whatever this is started. James turned from the viewport. We were discussing mythology, then alarms, then she left. Very informative morning. Maya studied him with the unsettling perception that came from spending years in close quarters with a small crew. You're doing the thing where you pretend nothing's happening while your brain works overtime. I've seen that look when you're translating impossible grammar structures. What aren't you telling me? That would be a very long list. Start with why you look like someone just rearranged your entire universe. Before James could deflect, Alina burst into the observation deck with the manic energy of a scientist who just witnessed something unprecedented. They're having a formal challenge, a political challenge, to Thalara's authority. I've been monitoring the public feeds and the translation matrices are struggling, but from what I can parse, someone on their high council is questioning her fitness to lead the contact initiative. James felt something cold settle in his stomach. Based on what? That's where it gets interesting. Alina pulled up holographic transcripts that flickered with uncertain translations. There are references to irregular consultations and compromised judgment, and something that keeps translating as either inappropriate harmonics or unauthorized resonance. The linguistic ambiguity is fascinating but deeply frustrating. Maya looked between them. Anyone want to explain what unauthorized resonance means? Or are we just going to stand here pretending that's a normal phrase? The door opened before James could decide how to answer. Kyron entered with the controlled urgency of someone managing a crisis. His usual humor was absent, replaced by grim efficiency. James Corrigan, you need to come with me. Immediately. What's happening? Counselor Vorin has formally challenged Thalara's authority to continue contact with your species. He's discovered evidence of your private sessions together, and is arguing that her judgment has been compromised by emotional involvement. Kyrn's expression was unreadable. She's required to defend herself before the High Council. You're being called as a witness. Maya made a sound that might have been a curse in 3 languages. Oh, this is bad. This is extremely bad. What kind of government makes their leader defend personal choices in front of a committee? The kind that spent 2 centuries trying to eliminate personal choices from the decision-making process, Kyrn replied. Thalara has been pushing back against that philosophy her entire reign. Vorin represents the old guard who believe emotion is a weakness to be purged. Your presence here has given him the ammunition he needed. James followed Kyrn through corridors that had transformed from welcoming to ominous, passing clusters of station personnel who watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. Alina and Maya trailed behind, ignored by the guards who seemed focused entirely on James. The council chamber was circular, tiered, and currently filled with beings whose attention converged on the central platform, where Thalara stood with the rigid posture of someone facing execution with dignity. Vorin occupied a prominent position, his features sharp and his ears more severely angled than Thalara's, giving him the appearance of a blade given consciousness. James was directed to a gallery seat where he could observe but not participate. The proceedings were already underway, conducted in Thalara's language with his interface struggling to keep pace with the formal, archaic syntax. You claim pure logic guided your decision to allow extended contact, Vorin was saying, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd practiced rhetoric for centuries. Yet evidence suggests otherwise. Private meetings with the human linguistics specialist, hours spent in isolated consultations. Tell this council, Commander, would you have granted such access to any member of the human delegation, or specifically to James Corrigan? Thalara's response was measured, controlled. Corrigan possesses the linguistic expertise necessary for meaningful cultural exchange. His role as primary liaison was strategically sound. Was it also strategically sound to experience resonance with him? The chamber erupted. The word resonance carried weight that transcended translation, rippling through the assembly like a shockwave. James watched Thalara's expression remain composed even as the foundation of her defense crumbled. The resonance, she said clearly, cutting through the noise, is not something one chooses. It emerges from quantum entanglement patterns that predate our civilization's attempts to engineer them away. Yes, I experienced it. Yes, it was directed toward a human. Neither fact negates my capacity to lead or my judgment regarding contact protocols. Vorin smiled without warmth. You've spent your reign arguing that we should honor emotion over logic, that our ancestors were wrong to suppress what they felt. Now you ask us to believe you can separate your personal feelings from your political duties. The contradiction undermines your credibility. Kyrn stood from his position in the council. If I may address the assembly. He waited for acknowledgement, then continued with the dry precision James had witnessed in the observation deck. Counselor Vorin speaks eloquently about logic and duty, yet I seem to recall that he himself formed a partnership bond based on resonance approximately 200 years ago, as did Counselor Thurin and Counselor Sala. In fact, he pulled up records with theatrical timing. Every member of this council who currently sits in judgment has, at some point in their extended lives, made decisions influenced by resonance, romantic attachment, or what we politely called personal considerations when it was convenient. Several counselors shifted uncomfortably. Vorin's expression hardened. Those were bonds between our own people, not with aliens whose biology we barely understand and whose lifespans are measured in decades rather than centuries. So the objection isn't to emotion affecting judgment, Kyrn pressed. It's to whom that emotion is directed, How progressive of you. The objection, Voron snapped, is to our commander compromising first contact protocols for personal gratification. These humans are unknown quantities. Their capacity for deception, their political stability, their long-term intentions, all unknown. Yet Thalara would have us trust them because she felt a connection with one individual. That's not leadership. That's adolescent infatuation. James had been silent through all of this, playing the role of passive observer, but something in Voron's tone pushed him past caution. He stood, and the chamber's attention swiveled toward him with the weight of dozens of 300-year-old stares. "May I speak?" His voice came out steadier than he felt. Thalara met his eyes across the chamber, and he saw both warning and resignation in her expression. She nodded slightly. "I'm not a politician," James began, his translator's instincts guiding his word choice toward maximum clarity. "I'm a linguist. I study how people communicate, how they build bridges across differences, how they find common ground when everything suggests they shouldn't be able to understand each other at all. I've spent 20 years doing this work, and I've learned that the most important communications aren't about data transfer. They're about recognition." He took a breath, aware that everything he said next would have consequences that rippled far beyond this chamber. "When I met Commander Thalara, I felt something I've only felt once before in my life, and that previous time taught me exactly how rare and inexplicable genuine connection is. I don't understand your resonance. I don't have the biological capacity for it, but I know what it feels like to recognize someone before your brain has finished processing who they are." Voron's expression was contemptuous. "The testimony of one human about his feelings proves nothing. It proves I'm not deceiving anyone, including myself. It proves she isn't either." James looked directly at Thalara. "You want to know if you can trust humans. Here's what we are. Illogical, emotional, ridiculously short-lived creatures who keep making art and falling in love and building things that outlast us, because we refuse to accept that the universe is just mathematics. We're chaotic and contradictory and will probably disappoint you in 1,000 ways. But we're also honest about what we feel, even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's inconvenient." The chamber was silent. James continued, feeling momentum build. "Commander Thalara has done nothing wrong except acknowledge a connection that your own biology validated. If that disqualifies her from leadership, then you're saying that feeling anything genuine makes someone unfit to make decisions. And if that's really what you believe, then I'm not sure our species have anything to learn from each other." He sat down, heart hammering, aware that he just either helped or devastated Thalara's position, and wouldn't know which until the council responded. Thalara spoke into the silence, her voice carrying harmonics that made his interface struggle. "Counselor Voron asks if I can separate personal feeling from duty. The answer is no, I cannot. None of us can, not really. What I can do is acknowledge what I feel while still making decisions that serve my people's interests. The resonance with James Corrigan doesn't blind me to the complexities of contact. If anything, it makes me more aware of how crucial it is that we proceed carefully, honestly, and with full understanding of what's at stake." She turned to address the full council. "I've spent my reign arguing that we lost something vital when we decided logic was superior to emotion. This situation is uncomfortable precisely because it proves my point. The resonance exists for a reason. Perhaps it's telling us that the bridges between species aren't built on shared technology or compatible biologies. Perhaps they're built on the recognition that consciousness, wherever it emerges, seeks connection." Voron looked like he wanted to object, but several other counselors were nodding slowly. "I propose," Thalara continued, "that we proceed with the contact initiative under modified oversight. Increased transparency, regular reports, additional council review. But we proceed. Because the alternative, rejecting contact because it made us feel something unexpected, would be the most illogical decision this body could make." The vote, when it came, was close, but it was enough. The biohabitat occupied an entire section of the lower station, a carefully engineered ecosystem that somehow captured the essence of wildness despite being entirely artificial. James walked beside Thalara along paths that wound between plants whose bioluminescence painted everything in shades of blue and silver. Above them, the dome displayed stars that weren't quite Earth's constellations and weren't quite hers either. Something in between, a compromise the station's designers had programmed without knowing it would someday feel symbolic. Conditional approval with enhanced oversight, Thalara said, breaking the silence they'd maintained since leaving the council chamber an hour ago. Chiron called it the most grudging permission in the history of interstellar relations. I think he was being generous. James smiled despite the exhaustion pulling at him. Could have been worse. They could have ejected us out an airlock and called it a cultural misunderstanding. We don't use airlocks for political disagreements. We have special chambers that, she caught his expression and laughed. I'm joking. Mostly. There was an incident 300 years ago, but we've improved since then. That's moderately reassuring. They reached a clearing where the path opened onto a viewing platform, overlooking a pool that reflected the artificial sky with perfect clarity. Thalara settled onto a bench that adjusted to accommodate both their physiologies, and James joined her, careful to maintain the professional distance that felt increasingly absurd, given that an entire government now knew about their connection. You didn't have to speak, Thalara said quietly. In the council chamber, that testimony put you at considerable risk. Voron's faction won't forget. I'm a translator. Sometimes that means saying things people don't want to hear in ways they can't ignore. James studied the reflection in the pool. Besides, you were standing there defending something you didn't choose, to people who wanted to punish you for feeling it. Seemed like someone should point out how ridiculous that was. Ridiculousness isn't a legal defense in council proceedings. Maybe it should be. Might improve the quality of governance across the galaxy. Thalara's smile was tired but genuine. I spent most of last night constructing rational arguments for why the resonance didn't compromise my judgment. You walked in and essentially told them that logic wasn't the point. That connection, real connection, matters more than whether it's convenient or explainable. Did it work? The vote was 17 to 15, in favor of continuing contact. 3 abstentions because apparently some counselors are too logical to commit to positions. She shook her head. It worked enough, though Voron's faction will be monitoring every interaction, every decision, waiting for evidence that I'm unfit to lead. So no pressure. None whatsoever. James turned to face her fully. Can I ask you something about the resonance? You said your people had it for evolutionary reasons for choosing compatible partners, but we're not compatible. Not genetically, not in terms of lifespan, probably not in a dozen other ways I haven't thought of yet. So why does it register at all? Thalara was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns in the air as if writing invisible equations. I've been thinking about that. The resonance isn't just genetic matching. That's how we explained it when we wanted everything to be measurable and logical. But the old texts from before we decided emotion was inefficient describe it differently. They called it consciousness recognition. The idea that some souls, for lack of a better term, are tuned to the same frequency, regardless of the bodies they inhabit. That sounds more mystical than scientific. Science that's sufficiently advanced often does. She met his eyes. Your species has a concept, don't you? Soulmates. The idea that some connections transcend logic. We have the concept. Most of us are skeptical about the reality. Perhaps you're both right. Perhaps connection exists on a quantum level we're only beginning to understand, and perhaps that connection doesn't care about our convenient categories of possible and impossible. James felt something settle in his chest, a recognition that had been building since that first moment in the negotiation chamber. So what do we do with that? Assuming the council doesn't change its mind, and assuming your people and mine can figure out how to coexist without panicking. We proceed carefully, Thalara said. We acknowledge that this is complicated and potentially painful and absolutely unprecedented. We accept that you'll age and I won't, that our peoples are just beginning to know each other, that there will be political opposition and cultural misunderstanding, and probably a dozen crises we haven't imagined yet. That's the rational assessment. That's the rational assessment, she agreed. The irrational assessment is that I've lived for 347 years without feeling this particular frequency of connection, and now that I have felt it, the idea of dismissing it because the mathematics are inconvenient seems like the worst kind of cowardice. James reached out slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wanted, and took her hand. Her skin was warmer than he expected, and he could feel a subtle vibration beneath the surface. Whether that was the resonance or just alien biology, he couldn't tell and didn't care. I've spent 20 years moving from posting to posting, he said. Never quite fitting anywhere, never quite feeling like I'd arrived at wherever I was supposed to be. I told myself that was just how life worked for translators. We exist in the spaces between cultures, never fully belonging to either. And then I walked into your station and looked at you and thought, oh, there you are. That's not very scientific. I'm not a very scientific linguist. He squeezed her hand gently. I don't know what this looks like long term. I don't know if it's sustainable or wise or anything other than two people from different worlds deciding that connection matters more than convenience. But I'd like to find out, if you're willing. Thalara's expression shifted through a dozen emotions that his translator couldn't capture, landing finally on something that looked like cautious hope mixed with determination. The council granted permission for ongoing cultural exchange. You'll be staying on the station for at least 6 months, working as primary liaison. During that time, we'll have considerable professional interaction. Very professional, James said seriously. Extremely professional, with regular documented sessions and proper oversight, and absolutely no acknowledgement that we're using diplomatic necessity as an excuse to spend time together. I'm excellent at professional interactions. I professionally interact all the time. This is why I like humans, Thalara said, and there was warmth in her voice that made the formal words irrelevant. You find absurdity in everything and refuse to let it stop you. It's a gift, also possibly a survival mechanism. James looked up at the artificial stars. Your advisor, Cairn, he knew, didn't he, about the resonance? Before you told him. He's known me for 5 decades. I suspect he knew before I fully admitted it to myself. Thalara followed his gaze upward. He'll be insufferable about being right. I'm already preparing for decades of smug commentary. Decades, James repeated softly. You'll still be here when I'm old, when I'm gone. Yes, she didn't flinch from it. That's the reality. I'll carry this connection longer than you'll live to experience it. That's what it means to love someone whose lifespan is measured in decades when mine spans centuries. Love, James said, that's a definitive word. The resonance doesn't do uncertain. It's inconvenient that way. They sat in silence, hands still linked, while the biohabitat hummed with life around them and the station systems maintained the delicate balance of atmosphere and gravity that allowed 2 species to share space. Somewhere in the upper levels, the council was probably already drafting protocols and oversight mechanisms. Maya was likely calculating escape velocities and backup plans. Alina was undoubtedly documenting everything for the anthropological record that would make her career legendary. And here, in a garden built between worlds, 2 people who should never have met were deciding that impossible didn't mean wrong. So, James said finally, tomorrow we start the official cultural exchange program. Proper documentation, council oversight, everything by the book. Everything by the book, Thalara agreed, and unofficially. She turned to him, and the smile that crossed her face was worth every complicated consequence that would follow. Unofficially, I think we figure out what it means when consciousness recognizes itself across the boundaries of species and time. When two completely incompatible beings discover they're somehow perfectly matched. When the universe decides that logic is overrated and connection is everything. That's a terrible research proposal. The worst, she confirmed. Chiron will hate how unscientific it is. Good thing we're not doing this for science. No, Thalara said softly. We're doing this because some things matter more than whether they make sense. Because the most dangerous power in any realm, whether ruled by logic or strength or anything else, is the courage to feel something real and honor it despite all the reasons not to. James leaned closer, closing the distance that diplomacy and caution had maintained. Is this professionally appropriate? Absolutely not. Good. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a first contact between species that had no manual for this particular exchange. When they pulled apart, both were smiling, and the resonance hummed between them like a frequency finally finding its harmonic match. Above them, stars that belonged to neither Earth nor her world shone with indifferent beauty, witnesses to the small miracle unfolding in their light. Two beings from impossible distances, choosing each other despite every rational objection, proving that the universe's greatest mysteries weren't written in physics or mathematics, but in the inexplicable spaces where consciousness recognized itself and decided that connection was worth any cost. So, Thalara said, her hand still in his, shall we see where this goes? James thought about the months ahead, the challenges and complications, and the absolutely certainty that nothing about this would be easy. He thought about time and distance, and all the logical reasons this couldn't work. Then he thought about amber eyes and the feeling of coming home to a place he'd never been, and decided that some things were worth being illogical about. Yeah, he said, let's see where this goes. And somewhere in the station's upper levels, Chiron smiled and made a note to prepare several decades' worth of insufferably smug commentary, because he had been absolutely, perfectly right.